Before we begin, it is essential to state that the following story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Although set within a real historical context, the characters, specific encounters, and dialogues are entirely fictional and do not represent factual or documentary accounts. Have you ever wondered if a sound could have a physical weight? Can a noise stripped of its mechanical origin actually press against your chest until you can't draw breath? Most people think of war as a series of images, the grainy black and white footage of men jumping into surf or the smoke rising over a ruined cathedral. But for those of us who were there, war was a symphony of terror, played on instruments of steel and cordite. We didn't see our deaths coming. We heard them. I often ask myself if the young men of today, living in a world of digital silence, can truly understand what it means to be hunted by a rhythm. What happens to a man's soul when he learns to measure the remaining seconds of his life by the cyclic rate of a machine gun? Does the echo of that Hitler's buzzsaw ever truly leave the mind? Or does it just wait in the quiet corners of old age, ready to scream again? I remember the first time I heard it. It was June, and the air in Normandy was supposed to smell like apple blossoms and salt spray. Instead, it smelled like wet wool, burnt oil, and the copper tang of blood that never quite leaves your nostrils. We were moving through the hedgerows, those ancient suffocating walls of earth and root that turned every field into a kill zone. We had heard the stories during training. They told us the German MG42 was fast, but nothing prepares you for the reality of 200 rounds per minute. It didn't sound like a gun. An American Browning had a steady rhythmic thump-thump-thump that you could count. It sounded like a carpenter at work. But the MG42? It sounded like the world was being torn in half. It was a mechanical fabric ripping, a demonic hiss that blurred individual shots into a single, continuous roar of predatory intent. It was the sound of a beast that didn't need to aim, because it simply deleted everything in its path. The fear didn't come all at once. It settled in like the damp cold of the French rain. You'd be walking through a meadow that looked like a postcard, and then, without a second's warning, that sound would erupt from a hidden slit in a stone wall. In those first few seconds, you weren't a soldier anymore. You were a child trying to hide from a thunderstorm that could bleed you dry. We became obsessed with that sound. We talked about it in the foxholes at night, our voices low, as if speaking its name might summon a burst from the darkness. We hated it, yes, but there was a twisted kind of fascination there too. It was a masterpiece of killing, a piece of engineering so efficient that it made our own equipment feel like relics from a previous century. We envied the German gunners their power, even as we prayed for a mortar round to silence them forever. It was a heavy psychological burden, knowing that if you poked your head up for just 1 second, that buzzsaw could put 10 rounds through your skull before you even heard the first one fire. Survival, we soon learned, was a matter of music. You had to learn the tempo. The MG42 had a weakness, though it felt like a stretch to call it that: the barrel. Because it fired so fast, the friction generated a heat so intense it would warp the steel if the gunner wasn't careful. Every few hundred rounds, they had to stop. They had to change the barrel. That was our window. That was the only time we could breathe. We would lie in the mud, pressed so flat we felt like shadows, counting the bursts. 1, 2, 3. We were listening for that momentary silence, that 3-second gap where the German gunner would flip the side hatch and slide out the white-hot metal. In those 3 seconds, heroes were made and lost. You had to have the courage to stand up and run when every instinct in your body told you to bury yourself in the dirt. We learned to dance to the rhythm of our own executioner. I remember a boy named Silas, a farm kid from Kansas who could whistle better than a songbird. He was the first one to really understand the song of the 42. He'd sit there with his back against a tree, eyes closed, whispering, "Not yet, not yet, now," just as the gun would overheat and stop. He saved my life more times than I can count just by listening, but the weight of it starts to change you. You stop seeing the enemy as men and start seeing them as the source of the noise. You start to hate the sound more than the cause it serves. I saw men weep, not from wounds, but from the sheer exhaustion of being pinned down by that relentless tearing sound for 6 hours straight. It grinds your nerves into dust. It makes you want to scream just to hear something else, something human, something that isn't designed to turn you into a statistic. By the time we reached the outskirts of St. Lo, the MG42 had become the backdrop of our lives. It was the soundtrack to our breakfast of cold rations and our restless sleep. We had captured a few of them, and I remember looking at the weapon up close. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, all sleek lines and ventilated steel. It felt cold, even in the sun. Carrying our own weapons felt different after that. My M1 Garand felt like a toy compared to that industrial Reaper. There was a psychological weight to it. You realized you were fighting a machine that didn't care about your bravery or your letters from home. It only cared about the cyclic rate. We learned to respect the lethality, to move with a jagged, desperate speed, always looking for the flank, always trying to get behind the sound. Because once you were behind the gun, the terror vanished, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Now, 80 years later, I sit on my porch and the world is quiet. But sometimes, when a motorcycle speeds by or a neighbor rips a piece of heavy fabric, my heart skips a beat. My hands shake just a little, and I'm back in the hedgerows. I'm back in the mud, waiting for the silence, waiting for those 3 seconds to run for my life. We survived the war, but we never truly escaped the sound. It's a ghost that lives in the inner ear, a reminder of the thin line between survival and the void. I hope no one ever has to learn that rhythm again. I hope the world stays quiet, but I know better. Machines change, but the sound of fear remains the same. It's the sound of a man realizing he is fragile in a world of iron. Thank you for listening to this journey through the shadows of history. If this story moved you or made you reflect on the sacrifices of those who came before us, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten moments to life. Also, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What do you think is the most terrifying sound in history? Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Until next time. The transition from the beaches to the bocage was like moving from a nightmare of open space into a nightmare of claustrophobia. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the world shrank to the size of a single field. You couldn't see the horizon. You could only see the thick, impenetrable walls of green that loomed over you like the battlements of a castle. And behind every one of those walls, we knew a Maschinengewehr 42 was waiting. It's hard to describe the psychological erosion that happens when you are hunted by something you can't see, but whose voice dominates the very air you breathe. We started to develop a strange communal psychosis. We didn't talk about girls back home or the meals we missed anymore. We talked about the Ripper. We debated its sound like theologians debating scripture. Some said it sounded like a giant zipper being pulled by God. Others said it was like the hiss of 1,000 snakes. But we all agreed on one thing. When it spoke, the conversation of the world stopped. Everything else, the chirping of birds, the shouting of officers, the thud of our own hearts, was drowned out by that terrifying, high-velocity mechanical scream. I remember a specific afternoon near a village whose name has long since blurred into the fog of my memory. We were tasked with clearing a path for the armor, but the tanks were useless here. The narrow lanes were death traps, and the mud was so thick it threatened to throw the tracks off any Sherman that dared to push forward. So it was up to us, the infantry, the queen of battle. I was hunkered down behind a stone trough, my face pressed against the cold, damp moss. To my left was a replacement named Henderson. He was barely 19, with skin that hadn't yet seen a razor more than once a week. He was shaking, not with the rhythmic trembling of the cold, but with the erratic vibrations of pure, unadulterated terror. He had just heard his first MG42 burst. It had shredded the top of the hedge just inches above his helmet, showering him in leaves and twigs. He looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant, and he asked, "How are we supposed to fight that? How do you kill something that fast?" I didn't have an answer for him. I just gripped my rifle and listened. That's when I realized that the weapon wasn't just a tool of war. It was a psychological anchor. It held us in place, pinned not just by lead, but by the sheer impossibility of movement. The German gunners were artists of suppression. They didn't even have to hit you to win the engagement. They just had to keep that sound going. As long as that buzzsaw was tearing the air, you were a prisoner of the dirt. You became intimate with the soil. You learned the texture of the Normandy clay, the way it wedged under your fingernails and coated your teeth. You became a creature of the earth because the sky belonged to the MG42. I watched a veteran sergeant, a man who had survived North Africa and Sicily, lose his mind in that field. He didn't scream or run. He just sat up, right in the middle of a burst, and started trying to light a cigarette. It was as if his brain had simply refused to process the noise anymore. It had reached its capacity for terror and just shut the door. We tackled him back into the ditch, just as a line of tracers stitched a path across the very spot where his head had been. The fascination we had with the weapon was a dark, poisonous thing. We would find spent shell casings after a skirmish, the long, elegant brass cylinders, and we'd hold them in our hands like they were cursed artifacts. There were so many of them. The MG42 went through ammunition with a hunger that seemed bottomless. We wondered about the men on the other end of the trigger. Did they feel like gods? Did they feel the same vibration in their bones that we felt in our souls? We imagined them in their bunkers, surrounded by piles of empty brass, feeding the iron beast with a cold, professional detachment. We hated them with a fervency that was almost religious, yet we couldn't stop talking about their gun. In our barracks, or what passed for them in the ruins, we would mimic the sound to scare the new recruits. Brrrt. A short, sharp sound that meant someone's life had just been cut short. It became a shorthand for death itself. If you heard the thump of a mortar, you had a few seconds to dive. If you heard the crack of a Kar 98K rifle, you knew it was a single shot, a single chance. But the 42? If you heard it and you were still standing, it was only because the gunner hadn't decided to kill you yet. As the days bled into weeks, the emotional weight of carrying our own, slower weapons became a burden of its own. We felt outmatched, like we were bringing knives to a gunfight. Our bars were reliable, sure, and our M1s were the best rifles in the world, but they lacked that terrifying authority. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being suppressed by a machine gun. You feel isolated from your squad, even if they are only 5 feet away. The noise creates a wall of sound that severs all human connection. You can't hear orders. You can't hear your friend calling for help. You are alone with the Ripper. And in that loneliness, you start to bargain with God. You promise anything, to be a better son, to never complain again, to live a life of virtue. If only that sound would stop. Just for a minute. Just long enough to crawl back to the safety of the trees. But the most haunting part wasn't the sound itself. It was the echo it left in the silence that followed. When the gunner finally stopped to change the barrel or reload a belt, the silence that rushed back in was heavy and unnatural. It was a ringing, hollow quiet that felt like the world had died. In those gaps, you could hear the small sounds again, the groan of a wounded man, the rustle of the wind, the distant clank of armor. Those were the moments when the reality of what we were doing really hit home. The sound of the MG42 was a distraction, a sensory overload that kept you from thinking. But the silence made you remember that you were a 3,000-mile journey from home, standing in a stranger's field, waiting to be turned into meat by a machine. We learned to fear the silence almost as much as the noise, because the silence meant the dance was about to begin again. We were survivors, but we were becoming hollowed out, shaped by the rhythm of a German weapon that didn't know the meaning of mercy. The July sun began to bake the hedgerows, turning the humidity into a thick, invisible shroud that trapped the smell of cordite and rot. By now, the fascination with the MG42 had evolved into a grim professional respect, the kind a sailor has for a shark. We didn't just fear the sound anymore. We studied it. We had to. If we didn't decode the language of that machine gun, we weren't going home. I remember sitting in a foxhole with Miller, a guy who had been a mechanic in Detroit before the draft caught up with him. He was obsessed with the mechanics of the Buzzsaw. He'd sit there cleaning his M1 and talk about the recoil-operated roller-locked bolt as if it were a piece of fine jewelry. "It's the rate of fire, kid," he'd say, his voice barely a whisper above the distant rumble of artillery. "It's not just about hitting you. It's about the vacuum. It's about the air. He was right. When an MG42 opened up nearby, you could actually feel the displacement of the atmosphere. It felt like the air was being sucked out of your lungs by a giant, invisible lung. It created a sensory deprivation that was almost physical. You couldn't think in sentences. You could only think in fragments. Down. Mud. Stay. Wait. The psychological toll was becoming visible on all of us. Our eyes were getting that 1,000-yard stare. A hollow, sunken look where the light doesn't quite reach the back of the iris. We were becoming parts of the machinery ourselves, moving when the rhythm allowed, freezing when the rhythm commanded. We were no longer the cocky paratroopers and infantrymen who had crossed the Atlantic to save the world. We were just men trying to outlast a piece of German steel. One night we were positioned on the edge of a wheat field near St. Lo. The moon was a sliver of bone in a bruised sky. Everything was deathly still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Suddenly, a flare went up, a brilliant magnesium white that turned the world into a stark, two-tone nightmare. In that instant, a 42 opened up from a hidden pillbox across the field. But this time, it was different. It wasn't firing at us. It was firing over us. The tracers were like glowing red rivers flowing through the dark, arched in a terrifyingly beautiful canopy. I watched them mesmerized as they streaked toward some distant target. In that moment, I realized the true horror of the weapon wasn't just its lethality, it was its indifference. The gunner couldn't see what he was hitting. He was just painting the darkness with lead. He was an architect of a zone of death, and we were just the furniture inside it. The sound of the MG42 began to seep into our dreams. I'd wake up in a sweat, my hands clawing at the dirt, convinced I heard that ripping fabric sound, only to realize it was just the wind or the sound of someone tearing open a K-ration. It had colonized our minds. We started to give the guns names like they were pets or angry gods. Screaming Mimi, the Widowmaker, the Woodcutter. It was a way of humanizing the terror, I suppose. If we gave it a name, maybe we could understand it. Maybe we could negotiate with it. But you can't negotiate with a weapon that fires 20 rounds a second. You can only wait for it to get tired. You can only wait for the man behind it to blink. I remember seeing a squad of reinforcements arrive, fresh-faced kids who still had the smell of the States on them. They were laughing, joking about how they were going to mop up the Krauts and be home by Christmas. Then, the first burst of an MG42 echoed from across the valley. The laughter didn't just stop, it evaporated. I saw the color drain from their faces, replaced by a gray, sickly hue. It was the sound of reality hitting them. It was the sound of their childhoods ending in a single 1-second burst. One of them looked at me, his lip trembling, and asked if that was a big gun. I told him it wasn't the size that mattered. I told him it was the speed. I told him to listen for the barrel change, because that was the only music that would ever save him. The emotional weight of that period was a slow-motion collapse. You start to lose the ability to feel empathy for the fallen. When you saw a man get caught in a crossfire of 42s, you didn't think about his mother or his wife. You thought, I'm glad it wasn't me. And then immediately after, you felt a crushing guilt that made you want to vomit. The MG42 did that to you. It stripped away the noble veneers of war and left you with nothing but the raw, pulsing nerve of survival. It turned us into animals huddled in the dark, listening for the hunter's breath. We were surviving, yes, but at a cost that none of us could yet calculate. We were learning to live in the gaps between the bursts, and in those gaps we were losing the men we used to be. The rain returned as we pushed deeper into the French interior, but it wasn't the cleansing kind. It was a cold, miserable drizzle that turned the landscape into a blurred, charcoal drawing. By this point, the MG42 had become more than just an enemy weapon. It had become an obsession for our tactical planners. We were being told to fire and maneuver, a textbook phrase that sounded simple in the classrooms of Fort Benning, but felt like a suicide pact in the mud of Normandy. The problem was that the MG42 didn't just suppress a squad, it suppressed an entire zip code. It created a psychological barrier that felt as physical as a barbed wire fence. I remember a captain, a man who had been a high school principal in civilian life, standing over us in a ditch screaming for us to move. He was a good man, but he was shouting against the roar of a buzzsaw that was currently chewing the top 3 inches off the stone wall we were hiding behind. He wanted us to be brave, but the MG42 didn't care about bravery. It only cared about physics. There was a specific kind of dread that came with the sound of a barrel change. You'd think it would be a relief, but it was actually the most stressful 3 to 5 seconds of your life. In that brief window of silence, you knew that your window of opportunity was sliding shut. It was like being in a room where the walls were slowly closing in, and for just a heartbeat the mechanism jammed. Do you run? Do you stay? If you run and the gunner is fast, if he's one of those veterans who can swap a red-hot barrel with a gloved hand in the blink of an eye, you're caught in the open. I saw a man named Peterson try it. He was a track star from Ohio, a kid who thought he could outrun anything. He waited for the pause, leaped over the hedgerow, and he was halfway across the field when the gun spoke again. It wasn't a long burst, it was just a tap, a tiny adjustment of the gunner's thumb. Peterson didn't even fall. He disintegrated. The speed of the rounds hit him with such force that it looked like he'd been struck by a phantom freight train. After that, the sound of the gun started to change for us. It began to feel personal. You'd swear the gunner was looking specifically for you. We started to recognize individual guns by their pitch. Some had a slightly higher whine, a raspier tier, depending on how old the spring was or how dirty the mechanism had become. We'd sit in the dark and say, "That's the one from the farmhouse," or "That's the one by the bridge." We gave them personalities. The one by the bridge was Lazy Susan because the gunner fired in long, wasteful bursts. The one in the farmhouse was the surgeon because he only fired 3 rounds at a time, always aiming for the gaps in our cover. This personification was a survival mechanism. If we could make the gun a character, we could find its flaws. We could find a way to hate the man behind it, instead of just fearing the machine itself. But the psychological weight went deeper than just fear. It was the exhaustion of constant alertness. You can only live at a 100% stress level for so long before something inside you just snaps like a dry twig. We were all reaching that point. I remember looking at my hands one morning while trying to open a tin of meat. They weren't shaking, they were vibrating, a fine, high-frequency hum that seemed to match the cyclic rate of the German guns. My body had internalized the rhythm of the enemy. I was no longer a human being with hopes and dreams of Nebraska. I was a biological sensor tuned to the frequency of 1,200 rounds per minute. We all were. We moved with a strange, jerky grace, always flinching at loud noises, always looking for the nearest low spot in the ground. One evening, we managed to overrun a German position. For the first time, I stood in the nest where the MG42 had been. It was a surreal experience. The ground was literally carpeted in brass, thousands upon thousands of shell casings, still warm, smelling of burnt powder and hot oil. There were spare barrels lined up in their carriers, looking like strange prehistoric bones. I picked up the gun. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked, a dense mass of stamped steel and engineering. I looked through the sights toward the field where we had been pinned down. From this side it looked so easy. The field was a perfect killing floor. I felt a sudden, sickening surge of vertigo. I realized that to the man who stood here, we weren't soldiers, heroes, or even enemies. We were just shapes moving through the grass, targets to be serviced by a high-speed delivery system. The weapon stripped the humanity from both ends of the barrel. I stood there for a long time, just holding the cold steel of the charging handle. My sergeant came up behind me and told me to drop it, that it was bad luck to touch the damn thing. I let it fall back onto its bipod with a heavy clatter. As we walked away to continue the advance, I realized that the terror of the MG42 wasn't just in the noise it made or the men it killed. It was in the way it turned the world into a factory. It turned war into a production line of casualties, efficient and loud. We were surviving, but the music of the war was changing us into something harder, colder, and much quieter. We were learning to live with the buzzsaw, but we were beginning to wonder if we'd ever be able to hear anything else. As we pushed further into the heart of France, the Hitler's buzzsaw began to feel less like a weapon and more like a permanent feature of the weather. You didn't ask if it was going to rain. You just asked when the next storm of lead would break. We were moving through a dense patch of woods near a creek that had overflowed its banks. Everything was slick, gray, and miserable. By now, the fascination we had with the MG42 had curdled into a dark, hollow hatred. Not the kind of hatred that makes you scream and charge, but the kind that makes you cold and silent. We had seen too many good men turned into pink mist because they didn't respect the rhythm. I remember looking at a fellow soldier, a guy we called Preacher because he carried a Bible in his breast pocket. He was staring at a tree that had been literally sawed in half by a sustained burst. He wasn't praying. He was just touching the shredded wood with a look of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. "It's not a gun," he whispered. "It's a harvester." That was the realization that haunted our nights. The Americans built things to be used by men, but the Germans, with the MG42, had built a man to be used by a machine. The gunner was just an accessory, a feeder for the iron mouth. We started to feel a strange, twisted empathy for the German gunners, a realization that they were as much slaves to that rhythm as we were. They had to carry the extra barrels, the heavy ammunition boxes, the tripod that bit into their shoulders. They were tethered to that noise, but that empathy died the moment the first round cracked over our heads. The emotional weight of being the prey in this industrial hunt was starting to fracture our unit's spirit. We were no longer a cohesive squad. We were a collection of individuals, each of us trying to calculate our own odds of survival based on the distance to the next foxhole. I recall a moment in a sunken road where the sound of a distant .42 started to echo off the stone walls. Because of the acoustics, it sounded like the gun was everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a phantom noise, a ghost scream that rattled our teeth. One of the new replacements, a kid who hadn't been in country for more than 48 hours, simply broke. He dropped his rifle, covered his ears, and began to scream at the top of his lungs, trying to drown out the mechanical tearing. It was a heartbreaking sight. He wasn't wounded, not physically, but the sound had reached inside him and snapped the mainspring of his courage. We had to drag him into a cellar, his screams mingling with the distant brrrt of the gun. The MG42 didn't just kill the body, it sought out the cracks in your mind and hammered at them until they opened wide. We began to notice that the veteran gunners had a style. Some would fire in shorts, 3 or 4 rounds that sounded like a quick cough. Those were the ones to really fear. It meant the man behind the sights was disciplined, patient, and wasn't wasting his heat. When you heard those short, sharp barks, you knew you were dealing with a pro. It made the air feel even tighter. We'd lie there in the mud, our faces pressed into the decaying leaves, and we'd pray for a green gunner. Someone who would get excited and melt his barrel in one long, panicked roar. We were gamblers, and the stakes were our lives. We'd bet on the silence. We'd bet on the 3 seconds it took to swap the steel. It was a hell of a way to live, measuring your existence in the time it takes for a piece of metal to cool down. The psychological fascination with the sound never truly faded. It just became part of our internal architecture. I remember one night, hunkered down in the ruins of a barn, watching the rain leak through the shattered roof. Miller was there, tinkering with a captured German Luger he'd found. He looked at me and said, "You think they'll ever make something that fast back home?" I told him I hoped not. I told him I wanted to go back to a world where the fastest thing I heard was the whistle of a train or the beat of a drum. But deep down, I knew the world had changed. The MG42 had set a new tempo for humanity, a frantic, mechanical pace that didn't leave room for the slow, quiet moments we used to cherish. We were becoming a generation that understood the value of a second because we had seen what 1,200 rounds could do to one. There was an emotional numbness that started to set in after the first month. You'd see a burst of tracers stitch across a field, and instead of gasping, you'd just think about the trajectory. You'd see a comrade fall, and instead of weeping, you'd check his ammo pouches. The MG42 had taught us the ultimate lesson in utility. If it didn't help you survive the next burst, it didn't matter. We were being stripped down to our most basic elements: fear, instinct, and a desperate, clawing need to reach the end of the day. The buzzsaw was the tool that did the stripping. It filed away our edges until we were as smooth and cold as the bullets it fired. We were surviving, but we were beginning to look in the mirror and not recognize the men staring back. We were the survivors of Normandy, but we were also the children of the MG42, born in fire and raised in the shadow of a sound that never quite goes away. By the time the hedgerows began to give way to the open plains of the French interior, the sound of the MG42 had become the primary rhythm of our existence. It was no longer an external threat. It was a heartbeat. We had lived under its shadow for so long that the silence of a quiet afternoon felt like a physical threat. I remember a day in late July when the heat was so intense it felt like the air itself was ready to ignite. We were approaching a small cluster of farm buildings, the kind of place that should have been peaceful, but the air was still, too still. Then, from a hayloft 300 yards away, that familiar tearing sound erupted. It didn't startle us anymore. We didn't jump. We simply transitioned from walking men to crawling shadows in a single fluid motion. We had become experts at reading the dirt, finding the microscopic depressions in the earth that could shield a human body from a stream of lead. The fascination we felt for the weapon had now turned into a grim, dark kind of humor. We would joke about the German tailor who was trying to sew our shrouds. It was a way to keep the mind from fracturing. I saw a man named Collins, a joker from Brooklyn, pick up a discarded German ammo belt and wear it like a scarf. "Look at me," he'd say. "I'm dressed for the symphony." But his eyes didn't match his grin. His eyes were hard and fixed on the tree line. We all knew that the symphony could start at any moment. The psychological weight of that weapon was its ability to turn every bush, every window, and every shadow into a potential source of extinction. You couldn't trust the landscape anymore. The MG42 had weaponized the very geography of France. It wasn't just a gun. It was a system of denial. It denied us movement, it denied us sleep, and it denied us the luxury of feeling safe for even a moment. I recall a night when we were pinned down in a drainage ditch. The water was waist-deep and fouled with the runoff of the battlefield. A German gunner was systematically searching the ditch with long, searching bursts. He wasn't aiming at anything specific. He was just raking the line, letting the high cyclic rate do the work for him. The sound was different in the dark. It felt more intimate, like a whisper shouted directly into your ear. I remember pressing my face into the cold, wet mud and feeling the vibrations of the impacts in the bank above me. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of a machine trying to find me. I found myself thinking about the man on the other end. Was he tired? Was he scared? Or was he just another part of the mechanism feeding the belt, changing the barrel and staring into the dark just like I was? In those moments, the war stopped being about ideology or nations. It became a dialogue between two terrified men, separated by a field and joined by a stream of tracers. The emotional toll of this constant suppression was a slow, agonizing erosion of the self. You start to lose your sense of future. You don't think about what you'll do after the war. You think about what you'll do in the next 5 seconds. The MG42 forces you into a radical present. It strips away the past and the future until all that remains is the vibration of the air and the smell of hot oil. I saw men who had been the life of the platoon turn into silent ghosts, their mouths moving in wordless prayers every time the buzzsaw spoke. We were all being reshaped by the noise. We were being forged into something harder, something that could withstand the friction of the 1-200 rounds per minute. But you can't be forged without losing something of your original shape. We were losing our softness, our capacity for wonder, and our belief in the fundamental safety of the world. There was a strange sense of loss that came whenever we silenced a gun. We'd flank the position, toss a couple of grenades, and suddenly, the noise would stop. The silence that followed was always heavier than the one before. We'd walk up to the nest and see the gunner slumped over the receiver, his hand still charred from the heat of the barrel. And you'd look at the gun, that magnificent, terrible piece of engineering, and you'd realize that it was just a thing. It was just steel and springs and wood. Without the man, it was silent. Without the noise, it was harmless. But the noise didn't stay in the gun. It stayed in us. We carried the bird in our marrow. We carried the rhythm in our pulse. Even when the gun was captured, the terror remained, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. By the time we were ready to push toward the borders of Germany itself, we were different men. We had learned to live with the MG42, to respect its lethal tempo, and to survive its mechanical rage. But the fascination remained, a dark stain on our memories. We had learned that a sound could be a weapon, that a rhythm could be a cage, and that a machine gun could be the architect of a man's soul. We were the veterans of Normandy, the survivors of the Buzzsaw, and we were moving forward into a world that would never again sound the same. We were waiting for the next burst, the next silence, and the next chance to prove that a human heart could still beat, even when the world was trying to saw it in half. The war eventually moved away from the hedgerows and into the open rolling plains that led toward the German border, but the shadows of Normandy followed us like a persistent fever. By August, we were different creatures. We had survived the Buzzsaw, but we were scarred by its cadence. I remember standing on a ridge, looking back at the miles of territory we had fought for, and realizing that the landscape was silent. No more tearing fabric, no more mechanical screams, yet in the ringing of my ears the sound persisted. It's a strange thing to survive a nightmare. You expect a sense of triumph, but all I felt was a profound, hollow quiet. I looked at the men left in my squad, the few of us who had started on the beaches, and I saw that we were all listening for something that wasn't there. We had become so accustomed to the lethal tempo of the MG42 that the natural world felt wrong. The wind in the grass sounded too much like a distant burst. The snap of a dry twig made us reach for the dirt. We were homebound in spirit, perhaps, but our nervous system still belonged to the German gunners. The final emotional weight of that weapon didn't hit me until we reached a small surrendered town near the border. There, in a pile of discarded equipment, sat a lone MG42, its bipod broken, its barrel warped into a grotesque curve from overheating. It looked pathetic. It looked like a piece of junk. I stood over it for a long time, the rain dripping off my helmet and onto the rusted shroud of the gun. I realized then that this machine had been the focal point of my entire existence for months. My every thought, my every prayer, and the deaths of my closest friends had revolved around this hunk of stamped steel. It felt like an insult that something so mechanical, so unfeeling, could have possessed such power over our souls. I wanted to kick it, to smash it into the mud, but I just stood there shaking. I realized that the MG42 hadn't just terrorized us with its bullets. It had terrorized us by proving how fragile we were. It had shown us that 200 rounds per minute could erase a lifetime of memories, dreams, and love in the span of a single heartbeat. I think back to Silas and Miller and the boys who didn't make it out of the bocage. I wonder if in their final moments they were thinking of the song of the gun. I hope they heard something else. Something peaceful. But for those of us who lived, the MG42 became a part of our identity. We are the men who heard the devil's zipper and didn't blink. Or more accurately, we are the men who blinked and were lucky enough to open our eyes again. We learned that survival isn't always about being the strongest or the bravest. Sometimes it's just about being the one who hears the barrel change at the right second. That realization carries a heavy burden of survivor's guilt. Why did the buzzsaw skip over me and find the man next to me? There is no logic to it, only the cold, impartial mathematics of a high-speed firing pin. Decades have passed now. I live in a quiet town where the only buzz I hear is the sound of my neighbor's lawnmower on a Saturday morning. My grandchildren look at my old medals and ask me what it was like. How do you tell a child that the most significant part of your youth was defined by the cyclic rate of an enemy machine gun? How do you explain that you can still feel the vibration of the air in your teeth when the room gets too quiet? I usually just tell them it was loud. I tell them we did our jobs and we came home. But sometimes when the sun goes down and the shadows stretch long across the grass, I find myself counting. 1, 2, 3. I'm still listening for the pause. I'm still waiting for those 3 seconds of silence that mean I'm allowed to live for another day. The MG42 might be a relic in a museum now, but in the minds of the men who faced it, it never truly stopped firing. We learned to survive the darkness by understanding the rhythm of the light, the tracers, the flashes, the sparks of the barrel change. We survived by turning our fear into a science. But as I sit here now, an old man with more memories than time, I realize that the greatest victory wasn't taking the hill or silencing the gun. The greatest victory was eventually learning to listen to the silence again without being afraid of what was hiding inside it. We were terrorized by the first shot, yes, but we were redeemed by the last one. The war is over, the guns are cold, and the only thing left is the story of how we kept walking when the world was trying to saw us in half. We are the ones who heard the nightmare and lived to tell the tale, carrying the echo of the MG42 as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for staying with me through these memories of a time when the world was defined by fire and steel. It's important that we don't forget the sounds of history, because they remind us of the price of the silence we enjoy today. If you found this story meaningful and want to help us preserve these echoes of the past, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe that the tools of war change the men who use them? Or is it the other way around? Your support ensures these stories are never silenced. Until we meet again.